What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Everyday Builds. Today I'm going to share with you a method for building floating shelves that I think is the best way to build floating shelves. So without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. I start by cutting out what will be the top and bottom pieces for each shelf. For the length, I cut them about an inch longer than I need, since I'm going to come back and square up each end later. As for the depth of the shelf, these are cut to their final size, which I calculate by the total depth of the finished shelf that you want minus a 1/4 inch. This is going to make sure that we account for the face that we're going to add to these later. Once I have the pieces cut out, I use painter's tape to mark which boards I'd like to go together. It also marks which side I'd like visible and also the front edge. It's important to know which one is the front edge because we're going to take it over to the table saw and we're going to put a 10-degree bevel on the back side. What this 10-degree bevel is going to do is allow the shelf to sit more flush with the wall. And here's a close-up of how that works. By removing material from the bottom, it allows that top edge to get as close to the wall as possible in case there's any imperfections in the wall. It's just a little detail. Also makes scribing easier if any of that is needed. And like I said earlier, I cut these a little bit long so that I could come back and square up each end and also get them to their final dimension. Now that we have our top and bottom pieces cut out, we can now move on to the facing of our shelves. And here's a little preview of what we're going to be making. It's the little T-shaped molding, and you can see how the plywood panels we just cut out are going to tie right into that. For the shelves I'm building, I'm using a 5/4 rough sawn white oak, but any other hardwood will do just fine as long as it's 3/4 of an inch thick. This step here may not be necessary for everybody. You can absolutely go to any big box store and buy S4S lumber, which is already surfaced, square, and ready to go. But if you are interested in the milling process, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make a video in the future. Now that my pieces are milled up, it's time to cut what are called rabbets, which is really just removing a square chunk from each edge, as you can see in the picture here. These rabbets are what is going to accept the top and bottom panels that we cut out earlier. And it's right about this point where I'm noticing something is definitely wrong with my dust collection. Once that first pass is complete, I then set my blade to its final height and set the blade at 2 degrees. That 2-degree bevel is going to make sure that this facing, when it contacts the panels we cut out earlier, is going to get a nice tight glue joint. Turns out my dust collection actually inside of the saw is completely clogged at this moment, and this is the result. The shelves I'm building each have one exposed end, or an end that's going to have to be finished with this facing. The other end will be butt up against some cabinets and it will not be seen. So in order to create this finished end, I'm going to be mitering these at a 45, which will come together to give that nice finished end, almost continuous grain look. I intentionally left these pieces slightly long so that I could come back and trim them after everything was milled up. But I'm still going to leave them about a 1/4 inch long because I'm going to flush them up perfectly later on. And here's a great visual of why we put that 2-degree bevel on that second rabbet cut. You can see how that visible edge is going to be the first thing to contact that piece of facing trim. And that's what we want. It also promotes the glue to push downwards instead of it coming towards the top. In order to glue this miter together, I'm going to be doing what's called a miter fold, which is essentially just using tape as a clamp to glue a miter joint. This is a great technique to use with solid hardwoods, but I do not recommend it for plywood to plywood applications. Squish. And while we wait for that glue to dry, we can move on to the kind of internal support structure, which is just a couple of spacers cut to the same depth as that middle rib on the facing piece. These not only help with assembly, but are going to ensure that the center of the shelf doesn't sag over time. The number and spacing of these is really dependent on the size of the shelf and personal preference. With the supports in, it was then time to work on the brackets for the shelves. For my support brackets, I typically use poplar or maple. In this case, I'm using poplar, and I start by ripping that down to 1 inch, which matches the same depth as those support pieces we just put in. Here I'm cutting up what are going to be the legs for the support bracket. And once I have my pieces cut up, I do a little mock-up inside the shelf to see what that structure is going to look like. Once I'm happy with it, I head back over to the table saw to cut a few dados in the rear support stretcher, or I guess the long piece. This is an optional step. It does not have to be done this way, but I do find that it adds more support to provide dados for those support legs to sit in. Once I have all my pieces, it's time to assemble. So I assume there's a few of you out there that are a little skeptical about wooden brackets and how much can they hold? And my question is, how much do they need to hold? So I did a little weight test, and I put 36 pounds on these brackets slash shelves, and they didn't budge at all. So I assume they can hold 50, 60 pounds. Is that enough? Now that the brackets are complete and my miters are dry, I can do final assembly on the floating shelves. The first thing I like to do is apply a little bit of glue to those internal supports and then grab my top piece and slide that into place and make sure that everything's lined up. And then I throw a couple clamps on and pin nail through the top into those supports. What this does is align that top and bottom panel, but it leaves that front-facing piece free, which allows me to then separate it from the two panels, but still keep it in place. Once I have the pieces separated, it then gives me a nice gap to apply some glue to. Once you have glue applied to both sides, I like to flip it up and then you can slide it down into place. I then put a parallel clamp across the back and then use these bandy clamps across the front because they're great at providing pressure in both directions. And then I threw on a few more small clamps just to provide a little bit more downward pressure. When I cut the rabbets, I make sure that it's a little bit deeper than the thickness of the plywood. This way I can come back after the glue up and use a flush trim bit to get everything perfectly flush. So I first started with the palm router to start flushing this up, and I just wanted to show that it can be done with a palm router. It works very, very well still, but it does not give me the stability that I have when I move over to the router table. So eventually I decided to switch back over to the router table, where it just offers more stability for the workpiece and I feel more comfortable overall. So like I said earlier, I left the facing pieces a little bit long so that I could come back later and give them a final trim with the track saw. If you don't have a track saw, you can absolutely do this with a circular saw, you can do it on a table saw, or even with something like a Japanese pole saw. After that, I gave everything a light sand, starting with 120 and moving up to 150. And here's a tiny little pro tip for small little tiny gaps like that, which are bound to happen. Apply a tiny bead of glue, give that a few little dabs, and then hit it with a sander, which is going to mix together the sawdust and the glue, fill that gap in, gone. I like to then go ahead and ease the edge with a 1/16 of an inch round over bit, and if you didn't make your shelves to the exact width that you wanted, this is where you can now go ahead and trim it to its final length. My suggestion is that you wrap it in painter's tape so that you can prevent tear out. And lastly, I applied the finish, which in this case is Rubio Monocoat's Smoke 5%, which is one of my favorites. And for a little added bonus, I got a little bit of footage of me installing these in the client's home, and it's one of those fun situations where you get to drill through tile, which is always a little bit nerve-wracking. But the install did go smoothly, and the shelves could not have fit any better. As this build comes to a close, I just want to take a minute to say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And if you did, please do not hesitate to hit that like button or that subscribe button. It really does mean a lot to me. So, until next time, I'm Jordan. This is Everyday Builds.